She arrived on a Wednesday. That is where the story begins. Though it does not feel like a beginning when you are standing in a yard full of frozen mud at 5 in the morning with a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other, watching a figure step down from a wagon that should not have been moving through that kind of cold at that kind of hour. You would have made the same choice he made. You would have lifted the gun. And then you would have heard what he heard, a voice saying one name out of the dark, a name that had been dead for 4 months, and you would have lowered the barrel just the same. That one name, that one voice. That is where everything changed. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She had come west on the strength of a dead man's letter, carrying almost nothing except the letter itself, and a stubbornness that would take the better part of a winter to fully reveal itself. He had been living on the strength of that same dead man's memory, carrying nothing except the ranch, and a silence that had grown so habitual he had stopped noticing it. Neither one of them expected the other to be useful. Neither one of them expected to be wrong. This is a story about what happens when the life you have narrowed down to its barest edges is met at the threshold by someone who has nowhere else to go, and both of you are too honest and too tired to pretend that the arrangement is anything other than desperate. The desperation becomes something else entirely, something that cannot be named as easily, something that once you have named it, you would not trade for the simpler life you thought you wanted. Stay with this one. It earns every minute. His name was Calhoun Drest, and he had come to the Laramie Territory 11 years before the winter this story belongs to. He had come with his wife, Marette, and a land certificate and a borrowed team of horses, and with the specific and slightly unreasonable confidence of a man who has studied something carefully and therefore believes he understands it. He had studied farming in a wet climate. The territory was not a wet climate. The territory disabused him of several misconceptions in the first season and a few more in the second, and by the third he had stopped holding opinions the land had not yet confirmed. Marette had been the one who confirmed most of them. She was a practical woman with a dry wit and a gift for identifying the one small adjustment that would turn a failing plan into a functioning one, and Calhoun had learned early and with genuine relief to take her corrections as the intelligent counsel they were. They had worked the land together for 8 years, and it had been hard in the way that most good things are hard, which is to say that the difficulty was inseparable from the value. Marette had died in the spring, 7 months and some days before the Wednesday this story begins. She had been sick for 3 weeks, with a fever that started as something manageable and became, with extraordinary swiftness, something that was not. Calhoun had sat beside her for the last 9 of those days without leaving the room except to keep the fire, and when it was over he had walked out into the early April light and stood in the yard for a long time without being able to identify what he ought to do next. What he had done was work. He had gone on working because the ranch required it, and because work was the one language his body still understood fluently when everything else in him had gone quiet. He had planted the season's crops, repaired the fence line along the eastern pasture, ridden to the town of Greer twice for supplies, and spoken perhaps 40 words to anyone across both trips. He had hired a hand for the summer, a young man named Oris who was competent and tactful enough to understand that conversation was not part of his wage. And by August, the crops were in, and Oris had gone south, and Calhoun was alone again. Which was different now than it had been before, because before he had not noticed the silence, the way you notice the absence of a sound. You had stopped hearing his sound at all. He was 38 years old. He had 214 acres, roughly 60 under cultivation, a solidly built house, an adequately stocked root cellar, and a loneliness he had decided to call simplification, because simplification implied he had chosen the condition rather than arrived at it by subtraction. It was in October that he received a letter from an old man named Pell Wakeman. Pell was the closest thing Calhoun had to a partner from before, a man who had known both Calhoun and Marate from their earliest days in the territory, and who ran a small operation 60 miles north with a competence Calhoun respected. Pell had written twice a year in all their years of acquaintance, his letters long and digressionary and full of precise observations about weather and soil and the particular character of the people who passed through that country, and Calhoun had always read them twice. The letter he received in October was different. It was shorter, written in a hand slightly less steady than Pell's usual, and Calhoun read it 4 times before he put it down. It said that Pell was not well and did not expect to be well again, and that he had a granddaughter named Sarah Wakeman, presently in Missouri, who had been intending to come west since spring, but had been delayed by circumstances he did not entirely detail. He said Sarah was 26 years old, and capable and not inclined to be a burden to anyone, and that he had hoped to have her with him at the end, but now was not certain. The timing would cooperate. He was writing to Calhoun because he trusted Calhoun's judgment more than he trusted most people's good intentions, and he was asking, not instructing, whether Calhoun might be willing to receive Sarah if she arrived after things had concluded for Pell himself. He believed, though he did not say why, that Calhoun needed something he was not able to identify for himself. Near the close of the letter, in the careful way of a man choosing words for precision rather than grace, Pell said that Sarah would not accept help that was not honestly offered, and that Calhoun should not write back saying yes unless he meant it straightforwardly. Calhoun wrote back saying yes, he meant it straightforwardly. Pell Wakeman died 12 days after sending the letter, which meant his death, and Calhoun's reply crossed somewhere in the middle of 60 miles of Autumn Road. The wagon that arrived on the Wednesday in December was driven by a man from Greer named Albro, who occasionally carried people and parcels for a small fee, and who had met Sarah. Albro had not expected the roads to be as bad as they were, and by the time he pulled into Calhoun's yard, he was considerably less cheerful than he had started, and his 2 horses were in a condition that suggested they felt similarly. Calhoun had heard the wagon from inside the house, which meant the horses were working hard enough to make noise. He came out with the lantern and the shotgun out of a habit that was less about fear than about the discipline of a man who has learned not to be careless. He kept the gun at a level that communicated seriousness without communicating intent, and then the figure, stepping down from the wagon, said clearly and without apparent distress that she was Sarah Wakeman and that her grandfather had written to him. He lowered the gun. Albro said something brief and profane about the roads, confirmed who she was, accepted the $1.50 Calhoun pressed on him, and turned the horses around with the visible relief of a man for whom the worst part of the job was now behind him. Calhoun held the lantern up. She was on the shorter side of medium height, wearing a coat that had been good at some earlier point in its history and was now simply functional, and she carried a bag that was clearly heavy and had clearly been carried far. She looked at him with the expression of a person who has been in transit for a long time and is reserving final judgment about the destination. He said she should come in out of the cold. She picked up her own bag before he could reach for it and came in. She ate what he said in front of her, cold cornbread and reheated coffee, without comment and with the focused efficiency of someone who has been colder and hungrier than this and is not inclined to find either condition remarkable. He sat across from her and let her eat without questions, because questions at 5 in the morning after a long, cold journey are not hospitality. They are an imposition with hospitable wrapping. When she was done, she set her fork down and said she understood. He had agreed to have her here, and that she was grateful, and that she wanted him to know she was not planning to be a guest. He said he understood that. She said she wanted to know what the work was and when it started. He said the work started when the daylight did, and described it briefly. The cattle that needed feeding, the fence line on the west side of the north pasture that had come down in the last wind, the root cellar inventory that wanted checking before the hardest part of the winter came in. She nodded, as if he had read off a list she already knew. She said she had grown up on her grandfather's land in Missouri before it was sold, that she could cook and keep accounts and was not afraid of cattle, that she had never mended a fence line specifically, but was willing to be shown. He said that was enough for a start. She asked where she would sleep, and he showed her the room that had been his and Mireille's, which he had not slept in since April, having moved himself to the smaller room off the kitchen when Mirette died and never moved back. It had stood empty and clean since then, as if he were keeping it for something he could not name. She looked at the room and then at him and said simply that she was sorry about his wife. He said thank you in a way that meant he had received the condolence and that she could set it down now, and neither of them needed to stand beside it indefinitely. She understood. She set down her bag, and he went to bed, and the house had 2 people breathing in it for the first time in 7 months. That was day 1. The days that followed had a quality Calhoun would not have called remarkable while he was inside them, because he was not in the habit of noticing the texture of his days until the texture had shifted and the previous one was visible by contrast. What he noticed first was that she was faster at most things than he expected, and that she had the discipline not to show. She noticed this herself. She would finish a task and move to the next one without looking at him for confirmation, not because she was indifferent to his assessment, but because she had done the task correctly, and the task itself was the confirmation. On the 3rd day, she corrected the way he distributed the hay when they fed the cattle, not with words but with action, taking the fork from him briefly, demonstrating the angle and the coverage, handing it back. He watched, adjusted, and did not remark on it, and she did not remark on his adjustment, and both of them understood from that exchange something about the other that would have taken weeks of conversation to establish. She could keep accounts. Calhoun was competent with numbers, but inclined to postpone the record-keeping in favor of physical work, and by Mirette's death, there had been a 4-month gap in the ledger he had not been able to make himself close. Sarah found it on the 6th day, asked him what he needed, and he told her the amounts and dates as best he could remember. She entered them in her own handwriting, which was smaller than Murray's and more precise, and when she was done, the gap was closed, and the accounts were current, and Calhoun found that he could look at the book again without the feeling of avoidance that had kept it in the drawer. He did not thank her specifically for this. He thought she preferred it that way. The fence line on the north pasture took 4 days in the cold. She worked alongside him on all 4 and asked questions about technique on the first day, and did not need to ask on the second, and had developed a small improvement to the bracing method by the third that he could see made sense, and said so. She told him where she had learned it, which was from her grandfather, and he said that sounded like something Pell would have worked out. And it was the first time he had said Pell's name aloud to her, and they both let it settle there for a moment, and that moment was the first time the silence between them was something other than provisional. In the evenings she cooked, because she was better at it than he was, and they both knew it almost immediately, and he cleaned up afterward, not assigned roles so much as mutual recognitions of where competence lived. She made things with the available stores that he would not have thought to combine, and they were good, and he said so. On the second occasion it happened, because the first time he had said nothing, and she had watched him eat in the way of someone, and by the second occasion he thought it worth clarifying that it was forming and was positive. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was the kind that changed the whole geometry of a face. There were evenings when they talked briefly and about concrete things, and evenings when they did not talk, and the quiet was simply the quiet of 2 people who have done enough physical work in a day to be at peace with silence. Around the 3rd week, he noticed that the second kind of evening had begun to feel companionable, rather than merely neutral, a shift he had not anticipated and did not know what to do with, so he did not do anything with it except continue to be present in it. She had started, around the 2nd week, to teach him words from the French she had grown up with alongside the English from her grandmother's side. The word for the way light looks when it comes low and sideways in the late afternoon. The phrase for the sound the wind makes, dropping from a high place to a lower one. He attempted them with the earnest awkwardness of someone who knows he is not doing it elegantly and does not care to pretend otherwise. And she corrected him without impatience. And there was something in the repetition of word and correction and repetition, teaching another how to say something true. She had taken to going to the high point of the South Ridge each evening before the last light went. He went with her on the 12th evening, not because she invited him, but because he happened to be finished with his work when she went, and she did not indicate this was unwelcome. They stood on the ridge and watched the light leave the rock and said nothing, and he understood that this was something she had done with her grandfather when she was young, maintaining the habit the way you maintain something when the person who gave it to you is gone. Because the habit is a kind of conversation with the gone person that does not require their presence. He did not say this. He stood beside her and watched the light go. On the 20th day, a man from Greer named Featherston came out to the ranch on a borrowed livery horse. Featherston ran the telegraph office and knew most things before they were common knowledge, and he had a complicated relationship with the truth that made him useful but not reliable. He came, he said, because he thought Calhoun should know something, and because he believed in civic duty when it did not cost him anything. What he said was this: a man named Berwick Crane, who operated a land and cattle concern out of Cheyenne, had begun making inquiries about Calhoun's property. Crane's method was to find or manufacture a financial obligation the property holder could not immediately disprove, attach it to the land through a cooperative clerk in the Territorial Land Office, and then arrive with a purchase note and a hired lawyer and an offer to settle, which was never an offer at all but a formality preceding a taking. Featherston said he had heard Crane's name come through in connection with the property 3 times in the past 10 days, and 3 times was not coincidence. Calhoun thanked him, offered coffee, and Featherston accepted and did not stay. After he had gone, Calhoun stood in the yard for a moment and then went inside. Sarah was at the table with the ledger open, and a look on her face that said she had heard the conversation. Because the windows in the front room had not been built with privacy in mind, she asked who Berwick Crane was. He told her what Featherston had said and added what he knew on his own account, that Crane had done this to a man named Hofstetter 2 years prior, and to a woman named Cook the year before that, and that neither of them had kept their land, losing it for amounts substantially below its value, and that the Territorial Land Office had in both cases been singularly unhelpful. She was quiet a moment. Then she asked if there was a legitimate debt anywhere that Crane could use, something real that could be reframed. He said there was not. The ranch was unencumbered. He said it as a man says something factually true that he knows will not be sufficient protection against what Featherston had described. She looked at the ledger and said the accounts were clean, and she could make them demonstrably so if he could get her the deed and the land certificate. He got them. She spent the next 2 evenings going through every record he had, and at the end she had organized them in a sequence that told a clear and unambiguous story of a fully settled and unencumbered property, the kind difficult to argue around in front of someone with legal training. She asked if there was a lawyer in Greer. He said there was one, a man named Aldous Brent, formerly a practicing attorney in Ohio, now useful for small matters in the territory. He said Brent was honest, which in this context was the relevant qualification. She said they should go see him. They went the following morning, the 23rd day, and Brent looked at the record Sarah had organized and said, in the careful way of a man revising his expectations upward mid-conversation, that these were as clear a set of land records. He said he would file an anticipatory record with the land office under a provision requiring the territory to notify the holder before recording any third-party claim, and that this would not stop a determined actor. Brent asked, in the mild way of someone with an obvious question choosing to ask it obliquely, how Miss Wakeman came to be managing Mr. Drest's records. Calhoun said she was staying at the ranch. Brent said yes, he had gathered that, and looked at him over the tops of his spectacles in a way that was not unkind, and said that there were arrangements that would provide stronger protective standing than the current one in the event of a legal proceeding. Calhoun said he understood. They rode back in a silence that was not companionable in the usual way, but had a different quality, denser and more attended to. The day was clear and very cold, and the road was white on either side, with fresh snow, and the light was the low, sideways kind that Sarah had given him the French word for. He said it aloud, quietly, just to himself, and she heard him and looked at him, and he said he had been thinking about what Brent had said. She said she had also. He said he was going to say something plainly because he did not know another way, and because she deserved the plain version. She said she was listening. He said that what Brent had implied was that two people living on the same property without the legal structure that made the arrangement intelligible to the territory's institutions created a vulnerability someone like Crane could use. He said he was not raising this because of the vulnerability, which was true in the sense that the vulnerability had clarified something that had been forming for longer than 23 days. The thing forming was not about the vulnerability. It was about her, specifically about the way she had taken the fork from him on the third day and given it back, about the way she had closed the gap in the ledger without making it a ceremony, about the way she stood on the ridge and let the light go without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was. He said he was not asking her to do something practical. He was asking her to do something he would want to do, regardless of Crane and Brent and the land records and all of it. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer until they reached the yard, and then she said, into the cold air, that her grandfather had thought this might happen. Not directly, but in the way he had, of not directly saying things, and that she had told him he was projecting his own affections onto a situation he could not see clearly from 60 miles, and he had said that was possible but that she should go anyway. She said she had gone anyway. He said he was glad. She said she was also. He said, because he had already said everything else in the plainest possible terms and there was no reason to be indirect now, that he was asking her to marry him. She said after a pause that was not hesitation, but consideration, yes. She said it the way she said most things, simply without decoration, meaning it. He nodded. She nodded. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that means something has been settled and the settling is enough. She kept her name and took his alongside it. They went back to Brent 3 days later, and he arranged the civil documentation with a discreet satisfaction that suggested he was glad to have resolved the ambiguity he had introduced. He filed the paperwork the same afternoon and told them, in his Ohio lawyer's way of speaking, that it would take an exceptionally creative interpretation of territorial law to attach a third-party claim to jointly held, properly married property. Calhoun said that was what he needed to hear. Brent looked at them both in the way of a man who has seen enough of life to know when something is genuine, and said he supposed they might have another reason to come back to his office at some point, for something other than a defensive filing. Calhoun said that was possible. Sarah said nothing, but the geometry of her face changed in that small, particular way. They drove home through the early dusk, and Calhoun said the French word for the way the light looked on the snow, and he said it correctly this time, and she did not correct him, which meant he had gotten it right. Berwick Crane came 12 days after that. He came in the middle of a morning when the temperature dropped below what was comfortable to work in, and both Calhoun and Sarah were visible in the yard, which meant he had timed his arrival to catch them in the open rather than inside, a small and transparent psychology. He came with 2 men, both larger and less conversational looking than Crane himself, and a third man wearing the deputy's badge of the Laramie County Sheriff's Office with the slightly stiff posture of someone wearing something that requires ongoing justification. Crane was tall, with a face shaped by years of calibrated good humor used in service of situations that were not actually humorous. He had a document in his hand, because the document was always the architecture of the leverage. The thing that said, "This is not aggression, this is administration." He said Calhoun's name with the familiarity of someone who has done research. He said he had a recorded instrument from a private lending concern, indicating an outstanding obligation against the property for $640, which he offered to resolve at a considerable concession. Calhoun looked at the document long enough to convey that he was reading it, not that he was unnerved by it. He handed it to Sarah, who looked at it with the focused skepticism she brought to account records. She said the recording date on the instrument predated Calhoun's title to the land by 4 months. Crane said that was a clerical matter, that the obligation predated the title transfer. She said an obligation predating the title could not have been attached to the title without the knowledge of both parties and the signature of the title holder, and there was no such signature on this instrument, which was not a clerical matter but a legal defect. Crane said the Territorial Land Office had recorded the instrument, and that its validity was therefore established. Calhoun said they had filed an anticipatory notice with the Land Office 3 weeks prior, which meant any subsequent recording against this property would have generated a mandatory notification to the holders. No such notification had been received. That meant either the recording office had not followed its own procedure, or the instrument had been recorded prior to the anticipatory notice, either of which would interest a territorial judge considerably. Crane was quiet. He had not expected the anticipatory notice. That was clear in the small internal shift of his expression, the recalibration of a man whose arithmetic has come out differently than he expected. One of the larger men moved slightly, and Sarah was already holding the rifle she had taken from inside the door when Crane had first come around the bend. She had been holding it at a downward angle in the way of someone who has not raised it because she has not needed to, and she raised it now by perhaps 4 inches, not pointing it at anyone but making its presence in the situation considerably more relevant. The deputy said he thought this was a civil matter, and that he was present only to observe. Calhoun said he appreciated the deputy's clarity, and that he hoped the deputy would retain that clarity when describing this visit to the sheriff, who was a man Calhoun knew from 3 county meetings. Crane said, in the smooth voice of a man retreating without using the word, that there appeared to be a documentation issue that could be resolved through proper channels, and that he would pursue those channels. Calhoun said that was his right, and that Aldous, Brent, and Greer had an interest in the matter and was prepared to discuss it at length on any day of the week. Crane looked at him once more with the look of someone revising a classification, moving Calhoun from one category to another, requiring a different calculation. He folded the document and put it in his coat and turned his horse without further conversation. The 2 larger men followed, and the deputy followed last, looking back once as he rounded the bend with the expression of a man quietly relieved that he had not needed to do anything. Calhoun stood in the yard for a moment. He said, not looking at her, but meaning her to hear it, that her grandfather had taught her well. She said her grandfather had taught her to read carefully. He said that was the same thing. She said it was close enough. Crane did not return. Not that week, and not the week after, and eventually not at all, because Brent had written to the sheriff, and the sheriff had written to the Territorial Land Office, and the land office had found a recording clerk who had done a thing difficult to defend in a formal accounting, and this difficulty had found its way to Crane in a form that made the dressed property considerably less attractive than 100 other available targets. Crane was a man who made his calculations carefully, and the calculations had changed. The winter finished itself out. The cold that came in January was the serious kind. The kind that moves into a place and occupies it as if it intends to stay permanently, and for 2 weeks the temperature did not rise above a point that was comfortable to work in. Northside had come down again in a wind and required it too. On the coldest morning she handed him a cup of coffee before he had reached the stove, and he took it and stood in the kitchen with the steam rising between them and the light outside not yet certain of itself, and he thought that this was a thing Murray had done in the mornings, not identically. She had had a different way of handing things, but the impulse was the same, the attention to the small morning need before it was expressed. He thought about Merritt and about what it meant that he could think of her now without the specific pain that had attended all his thoughts for 8 months. And he thought the pain had not softened so much as he had become more capable of holding it alongside other things, which was better than softening, because softening implied the thing had diminished and had not. It was simply no longer the only thing. He said, quietly and directly, that he had loved his wife. Sarah said she knew. She said Pell had told her, and that she could see it in the way the house was kept. The house of a person who had learned how to keep a house alongside someone else, and was continuing the habits, because the habits were a form of presence. He said, "Thank you." He meant more than the 2 words. She said her grandfather had also loved someone in the way that makes a house into something different from a structure, and had kept that presence in his habits for 30 years after her grandmother had gone, and that she had grown up inside those habits without fully understanding what she was inside until she was older. He asked if that was why she had come. She said that was part of it. The other part was that she had spent 3 years working in her cousin's dry goods in Missouri and had been useful and not unhappy, and had become aware, in the slow way you become aware of things you have been not admitting, that useful and not unhappy was a description of a condition considerably below what she believed a life could be. Her grandfather's letter had been a door that appeared at the moment she had begun to understand she needed one. He thought about Pell's careful sentence, the one that said he believed Calhoun needed something he was not able to identify for himself, and he thought that Pell had seen something from 60 miles away that had taken Calhoun 11 years. He said he thought Pell had looked further ahead than either of them. She said that was what he had always done. She said he had a quality of seeing where things were going before the things arrived, and that it was occasionally infuriating when you were young and considerably more valuable in retrospect. He said he knew the feeling. The geometry changed. He had come to read that smile, the way you learn to read a change in weather, as something that tells you something true about the day. By February, the winter had begun to release its hold in daily increments of 10 minutes more light and 2 degrees more warmth, measurable enough to count. They began the first of the season's preparation work, clearing and turning the soil in the sections that would be planted earliest. She made observations about the composition of the ground in the sections nearest the creek that were accurate and useful, and he adjusted the planting plan accordingly. She went over the plan with him in the evenings and marked the seed inventory against the planned acreage, and talked about a small herd expansion the following fall if the spring planting came in. Well, which was the kind of conversation that was also a statement about where she expected to be in the fall, and he attended to that dimension as carefully as the cattle logistics, and did not remark on it because the remark would have added nothing to what was already established. On an evening in late February she went to the ridge, and he went with her, as he had gone most evenings since the 12th day. The light on the rock was beginning to stay longer and have more color than the flat gray of January. She said the French word for it. He said it after her. He had the pronunciation reliable, now though still with the accent of a man for whom French is an acquired landscape rather than a native one, and she said this was fine because the word had come to her grandmother with the wrong accent that eventually became the right one, because it was his. He thought about a word passing from one person to another across languages and losses and distances, and arriving finally on a ridge in the territory, in the mouth of a man who had learned it in his 39th year. He thought that this was what most of the things worth knowing were like. They arrived late and through unlikely routes, and with the accents of everyone who had carried them. He said her grandfather had been a remarkable man. She said, yes, with the clarity of someone who does not need to qualify the truth. She said she missed him every day, not as a complaint, but as a statement of the ongoing condition, something present and factual that does not require resolution. He said he understood that. She said she thought it was one of the things, not the whole of it, but one part, why this had worked. She did not mean the legal paperwork or the ranch arrangements. She meant the two of them standing on the ridge saying the word correctly. He said he thought Pell had known it would. She said she thought so too, and that this was occasionally still infuriating because the man was not present to be told he had been right, which was the kind of thing he would have enjoyed quietly and at length. They stood as the light finished and the rock went cool and gray, and then walked back down together, taking the same 15 minutes in the slightly easier dark of late February, the days having begun to lengthen enough to leave something behind. The house had 2 people in it, and it had begun to have the particular quality of a house, with 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms and incorporated them, so that the daily life of the place was a kind of ongoing negotiation, conducted without negotiating. This was different from the first 2 weeks, which had been competent but attentive. 2 people performing adequacy for each other's assessment. What it was now was something easier and less visible. The invisible efficiency of people who trust each other's judgment and do not require constant demonstration of it. She had planted seeds in a wooden box on the south windowsill in the last week of February. Small things that would eventually become starts for the kitchen garden, and she tended them each morning with a care out of proportion to the current size of the things. He watched her sometimes from across the room and thought about all the forms of attention that are really forms of faith. He thought about Mirette and about the way she had tended things, and he found that the 2 women in his mind were not in the same place, but were not in separate places either. They occupied the same territory, the territory of people who had made a house into something more than a structure, who had paid attention to the small morning things, who had corrected him, each in her own way, each completely herself. He did not compare them, because comparison implies competition, and there was none, Only two true things a person could hold at once, one that had shaped him and was gone, and one that had arrived in the cold and stayed and was making something new from what remained. He thought Marate would have recognized something in her, a shared quality of not accepting less than the full measure of the thing, of doing it right, because doing it partially was not really doing it. A thing done right is worth the whole of the attention paid to it. He had begun to understand this again, not for the first time, but in the different way you understand something the second time, with the knowledge of what it costs to lose it, and what it takes to rebuild it, and the knowledge that the rebuilt version is not lesser, but simply marked by what went into making it whole. In the first week of March, the soil was workable along the south fence, earlier than usual, and they began the first planting together. He worked one row, and she worked the adjacent one, and they moved at close to the same pace, the unconscious calibration of two people who have worked alongside each other long enough to have internalized the other's rhythm. The sky was high and very blue, and the ground smelled the way ground smells in early spring, which cannot be described accurately to someone who has not knelt close to it, only experienced. She straightened from a row and looked out across the acreage and said, "This was good land." He said he knew. She said her grandfather had said it in the letter, that it was the kind of land that responded to being paid attention to. He said Pell had been right about that, as he had been right about most things. She said yes. She said she had written to him last fall, before he died, that she thought the West was not for her, that she did not see herself making the journey, that Missouri was sufficient. He had written back a single sentence that she was confusing the life she had settled for with the life she was capable of, and that the two were not the same. And she knew it. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. He said, "That sounded like Pell." She said it had made her angry for 3 days, and then she had started packing. He smiled. It was not a smile he produced often, and she saw it, and her own face did the thing with the geometry, and they went back to the planting. The rows came in straight and even, the way rows come in when two people know what they're doing, and know what the other is doing, and there is nothing wasted in the space between them. By the end of March, the starts on the south windowsill had become things that needed potting into larger vessels, and she moved them with the same careful, disproportionate attention, and they stood in a row like a small proof of the principle that things paid attention to return the investment. He watched them sometimes in the morning light and thought about Pell Wakeman, about his letter with its careful and uncompromising sentence, about the dying man who had looked far enough ahead to see what two living people could not see from inside their own predicaments. She caught him looking at the starts one morning and asked what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about Pell. She said she thought about him most mornings. He said he was glad Pell had written to her, and glad she had come, and glad he had said yes when the letter asked him to, and that those three things together had changed what the year looked like and what the years after it would look like. And that he was aware this was a large claim, but that it was the honest one. She said she was glad of the same three things. He said her grandfather had looked further ahead than either of them deserved. She said she thought Pell would say that the looking ahead was the easy part, that he had just pointed at a door, and the rest had been done by the people walking through it. Calhoun thought this was generous to Pell, and not entirely accurate, but probably the interpretation Pell himself would have preferred. and he thought that was itself a form of knowing the man. Outside, the light was the kind that arrives in early spring and means something different from any other kind, the kind that says what the ground held through the cold it is now prepared to return. He knew the word for it now. He said it quietly, in the other language, which had become the language he associated with the view from the ridge and with the corrections offered, without impatience, by someone who understood that the wrong accent is only the beginning of saying something right. A life is rebuilt by the most unexpected set of hands, not repaired to what it was, because that is not what rebuilding is, and the rebuilt thing is not lesser. It is only different, and the difference is the record of everything that went into making it whole, which is the most honest record a life can leave. The seeds were in the ground. The light was coming at the right angle. The house had 2 people in it, and both of them had found their way to it through a door held open by a man who could see further ahead than the living generally manage, and both of them were grateful enough not to waste what he had seen. She came expecting one thing and found another, and the other was better. He came expecting nothing and found that the nothing he had been living in had an edge, and beyond the edge was this: the work shared, and the accounts current, and the word said correctly, and the light named in 2 languages, and the rows coming in straight, and the silence between 2 people that does not require filling because it is already full. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole of it.